So before we get started, I think I should clear up a few things about what a whistled language is and isn't. Whistled languages are neither basic pidgins like those used by herders and animal trainers, nor are they languages which develop independent from the spoken word. A whistled language is simply the use of whistling to emulate the speech of a language, enabling the said speaker to communicate effectively anything they can in their normal language, but over far greater distances than screaming and at way less vocal strain. I mean, screaming bloody hurts for more than a minute, and is still only intelligible for less than a mile. But under the right conditions, a whistle is intelligible for 5 miles and sustainable too. So where are all the whistled languages? Well, this is a simple map of the Earth with a pin in every instance of a whistle language I found. As you can see, most of the pins are in clusters, primarily in Mexico, West Africa and Papua. Oh, and for anyone with an interest in linguistics already, that one in the Amazon is of course the one and only Piraha. You may also notice there's a common trait of most of these pins. They're either in the jungle, the mountains, or both. Now, unfortunately, the genesis of a whistled language has never been recorded, or even received too much study, but it appears whistled languages have developed as a response to relative isolation to help people communicate while hunting, shepherding, or just helping you talk to your mate on the next mountain without having to climb down yours and up theirs. So mechanically speaking, there are basically 2 types of whistled language, and this is decided by whether the language being whistled is tonal or not. And to be clear, non-tonal languages can absolutely be whistled, they're just a bit more complicated. So in general, when becoming a whistle, tonal languages are stripped of their articulation, leaving only tone, length, and to a lesser extent, stress. Now obviously, how well this works depends on the language. If, for example, you took Examplish from my How to Make a Language videos and applied it to this, you'd get an entirely useless whistling language, since there's no length, I've never defined stress, and the tone applies over the entire, highly synthetic words. For example, the word for was a dog would be and loved would be entirely identical since they're both 2-syllable words with a falling tone. And it's not like I went out of my way to find this example, there are literally only 3 root words outside of pronouns. Far better examples would be languages like, say, with its isolating structure making almost all words 1 syllable, and these are simple syllables too, without clusters in the onset and only nasals in the coda. What it does have is 7 to 8 different tones, so ingrained within the language that there's a tradition of young lovers communicating covertly on mouth harps, and, of course, farmers and hunters chatting across great distances in whistle. Of course, as most people who make languages agree, isolating tonal languages just aren't as sexy as polysynthetic ones with English phonology plus tl. So how do they work? In non-tonal languages, more articulatory features of the speech are retained. That's the stuff you're doing with your tongue and your mouth. Variations in timbre imparted by movements of the tongue and soft palate are transformed into pitch variations. Some consonants in spoken speech can be pronounced while whistling to change the whistle sound. And that's all very well and good to say, but it doesn't really help explain things. So let me introduce you to Silbo Gomero, a whistled version of Spanish used by inhabitants of La Gomera, one of Spain's Canary Islands. It's probably the best studied whistled language of the world, as opposed to all the whistled languages of other worlds. So first I'll go over the vowels. There are 5 vowels in Spanish, a standard 5-vowel system. Now here are the spectrograms of a person pronouncing them. And here is the same person whistling the vowels. So first things first, O and U look very similar, and in all analyses of El Silbo I've seen, O and U have the same whistle sound. You can probably also see that whilst the spectrograms are very different, the whistles are clearly mimicking something in the spoken sound. This thing is called the F2 value, and in general it would seem the F2 pattern, and only the F2 pattern, are transposed into El Silbo. In all honesty, there is a lot more complicated stuff going on here, but I scarcely understand most of it, and honestly you don't want to know. So I'll stick the source in the description if you want. In any case, if you want to make a whistled language like this, just get some spectrograms of your vowels, identify the F2 patterns, and turn it into the pitches of whistles. Easy! Next, what exactly is the difference between a whistled vowel and a whistled consonant? I mean, they're all whistles, right? So in terms of amplitude, or basically just loudness, vowels correspond to peaks and consonants to dips or just straight up silences. Vowels are also in a quasi-steady state, which is science for basically just a constant sound with little enough variation as you whistle that it's unnoticeable, whilst consonants are rapid movements, Kinda like how the consonant k is a rapid movement in the mouth, but e is a constant. There is also deviation in the tonal space, as consonant sounds are always higher or lower frequency bands, that is, higher or lower pitch, than vowel sounds. As for the consonants themselves, there have been multiple analyses of them, with the one being taught in schools, at least as of 2005, being a somewhat oversimplification, but I'll start there. So obviously there's no international phonetic alphabet for whistles, but El Silbo at least has a writing system. So there are the letters for the 4 vowels, A, E, I, and O, and 4 letters for the consonants. I mean, technically one of them is a digraph, that's 2 letters for 1 sound, but you get the idea. The consonants themselves can be split up 2 ways, whether they're acute with the rising transition or grave with the falling transition, and interrupted consonants, which are, well, interrupted versus the continuous ones. Within El Silbo, the interrupted consonants tend to be the unvoiced ones, and continuous ones tend to be voiced. This may be because Spanish's voiced stops, b, d, g, are pronounced as approximants, w, v, g, in most environments. Anyway, continuous acute is represented with a Y and makes the sound L, Y, N, Ny, R, R, D, and Y. Interrupted acute is represented with a CH and makes the sounds Ch, T, and S. Continuous grave is represented with a G and makes the sounds G, B, M, and H. Interrupted grave is represented with K and makes the sounds K and P. And so you get whistle transcriptions like this. So here's the part where I'm supposed to do a spoken sample, so I get to bring up just how friggin' long I spent trying to learn to whistle like this. I mean, I spent the majority of my research time with one finger in my mouth, just trying to whistle like it. I took time off to practice, somehow my dad learned to whistle with his hands halfway through and I still can't do it. I mean... Come on! My lips still hurt from trying too long. Actually, that's a lie. My lips still hurted from trying too long when I wrote this bit of the script. But whatever. So anyway, I guess you get my discount no hands whistling. Also, I have neither samples from speakers, nor IPA transcription, nor even spectrograms of these particular samples. So I'm almost certainly getting it wrong, and it's more just to get the idea across. Mama. Papa. Abuelo. And for some actually accurate ones without transcription, there's this.
Una botella de vino blanco.
As I said before, the 4-consonant system is an oversimplification and outdated. There is an additional sharp distinction to acute and grave, and a gradual decay separate to the interrupted and continuous, but I'm not going to go into them. In any case, if you were making your own magical language, you would probably want to make a chart something like this and convert all your consonants into it. The cultural importance of whistled languages varies from citation needed nawak to integral part of the language with inbuilt gender roles, chinatek. For reference, those gender roles are that men speak the language but women don't, even though they generally understand it. Whilst, as I said before, we don't exactly know how whistled languages came about, I would guess this is the result of heavy gender roles, especially ones that place women in positions where long-distance communication isn't at all necessary. Obviously, most cultures, and especially pre-modern ones, have some hefty gender roles, but in most cases there's still a reason for women to learn to whistle. Say you're in a fairly standard tribal hunter-gatherer setup where men hunt and women gather. Well, whistling is probably more useful for hunting, but long-range communication in forests while foraging could easily be a lifesaver. Hence, women would use the language and it wouldn't become a cultural norm for them not to. So gendered usage distinctions probably require some pretty hefty cultural stuff. Once existent, whistling would generally be used for long-distance communication and in crowds to call over everyone without yelling, but also for closer stuff like just for fun, and people going to see each other might start chatting from a distance via whistling, as long as they don't mind being overheard, and slip, sometimes in mid-sentence, from whistle to spoken word communication. Whistles may also be used for social communication, both in the form of a type of town crier, calling an entire town with the volume of a whistle, but also to warn people of approaching threats. For example, if pirates approach La Gomera, once one person noticed its approach, they could just whistle as loud as they could that a ship was coming and spread the message, and soon enough the whistle would be ringing across the entire island. Upscaling this a bit, Obviously these whistles aren't as reliable and won't go as far and as fast as fiery beacons for signalling an enemy invasion of a country, but they are more detailed, and if you had a whole country, or at least countryside of whistlers who spoke the same language, it's imaginable to have some kind of countrywide whistle warning system to alert the capital of enemy invasions and give detailed descriptions while doing it. But leaving wild speculation and going back to known effects, the whistles are known to have been used for secretive communication when some people don't understand the language. Apparently farmers from lower regions of La Gomera would whistle to their brethren higher up to warn them if anyone was being searched for by the police. Something would also be amiss here if I didn't bring up how almost all of these whistled languages are dying. Exact reasons vary, but it's often because they're seen as rural, peasant things, unnecessary with the invention of phones and walkie-talkies, or just inferior to learning the country's language. Silbo Gomero, for example, went through a decline from the 1950s up until the late 90s, where it was given official protection and introduced as a mandatory primary and secondary school subject in 1999. As such, the vast majority of speakers are either quite old or quite young, with very few speakers in between. And the reason for the decline, of course, was people turning away from agriculture and viewing El Silbo with a negative rural peasant association. So this is a segment I've put together speculating about whistling languages and their role in different fictional scenarios. Firstly, the idea of an independent whistling language, that is, a whistling language without a spoken equivalent. The problem with something like this developing is twofold. The first problem is that, unlike learning the native language as a baby, babies can't really learn whistling languages as a baby, since you have to learn to whistle first. I'm not even really sure what would happen if you tried to raise a baby only whistling to them. Maybe they would start humming back until they could learn to whistle, maybe just not speak until then, maybe never. I guess I'll add it to the list of mad experiments I'll try if I ever become an evil scientist. Obviously a child could be raised with a spoken language and a different whistled one, but the problem is here we do actually have a case study. There was formerly a language called Guanche in the Canary Islands before the invasion of the Spanish, and they did have a whistled form of their language. But as Spanish took over the Guanche people, they just started whistling Spanish instead, suggesting people will just whistle whatever their native language is, regardless. Now, if the English had invaded the Canaries, and a very unwhistlable language like English has replaced Guanche, maybe things would have been different, but unfortunately I think Guanche living on in whistles is probably the least likely outcome anyway. Whistled languages would also be a fairly interesting way to do magical languages, since they do sound somewhat interestingly natural and magical, probably because of how much they sound like birdsong, to the extent you get whistlers like Marcos Dominguez, who one day, walking through a cornfield, heard someone call him in whistle. He whistled back, "Here I am," only to get no response, and then realise he'd mistaken a regular bird's call for whistled language. Of course, if you're going for a magical language without ambiguity and all nouns are the true names of a thing, the number of distinct sounds in a whistled language could cause problems. But maybe there are just very specific whistled notes you have to hit, and magical folks have to spend vast quantities of their youth in whistling lessons, learning to hit the notes correctly, because if you whistle wrong, you could risk any number of magical catastrophes. As for sci-fi settings, it could be interesting to explore to what extent the typical universal translator technology in these things will work on whistles, since they're quite departed from your standard speech, and also their cultural importance and overall existence in a society where all of their traditional uses have been taken over by machines, with cyborg people easily able to communicate to each other in seconds with no vocal communication at all. For that matter, they could be interesting in dystopian societies for communication when using the regime's technology isn't safe, and serve as a nice bit of counter-symbolism, with the natural-sounding bird song directly contrasting the mechanical communications of the regime. Anyway, I don't really have anything much to say here. Maybe that I'm still mad I can't whistle with my hands. Ah well. If you want them, I have videos on making languages for you to then make a whistling language out of, and other videos too. If you want more of this kind of content, you could even subscribe. Thank you for watching, and good night.